Well, so if markets are so incredibly good in organizing in a society, in allocating scarce resources, the question arises, why don't we just organize everything in our society by markets? Why do we need central decisions? Why do we need governments if markets are perfect in allocating everything that is scarce? And I mean, if you look around you, pretty much everything is scarce, right? Time is scarce, goods are scarce, everything is scarce. So why don't we use markets for everything? Well, because there are some things that markets cannot do, and there are other things that markets should not do. This is what economists call normative and positive exclusion of markets. Positive exclusion means things that markets cannot do. Situations in which markets do not work. Usually we call these situations of market failure. Environmental problems, for example. This is a case of market failure, and we're going to talk about this in more detail later in this course. But this is a case of market failure. Markets simply cannot allocate scarce environmental resources easily. Another case of market failure are monopolies. So cases in which production and selling of a specific good is concentrated in a way that only one producer, one seller remains. If we end up in a situation like this, also markets do not function anymore. Another very famous example for market failure are public goods. Certain goods that have characteristics that prevent markets from working. Also, environmental goods are a good example for this, but I don't want to go into details on that. We are going to focus on the one market failure that has to do with environmental problems that is called external effects later in today's session. The other case that we have with markets not working is that we as a society decide consciously that we don't want markets to do the job of allocating certain resources. You might already guess from the slide what examples are. Well, usually examples that have something to do with quality, where a society wants to guarantee that a certain level of quality is kept. For example, academic degrees. If you want to take a PhD at the university, you have to work for that. You have to show that you're qualified. You cannot simply go to the next supermarket and say, you know, I'm paying 100 Australian dollars, give me my PhD, right? Why not? Because such a kind of degree should show that you are qualified for doing something. Another example would be driver's licenses, right? You're not simply selling driver's license. You have to take a driving course to be qualified to drive, right? You cannot simply go to the next shop and say, or next gas station and say, well, I'm going to pay 50 Australian dollars, give me my driver's license, right? The reason for that is that our society decided that there is a certain qualification needed for driving a car, for being called a doctor in something, right? In these cases, the society consciously decided we are not going to do this via market allocation. We need somebody to test quality in order to hand out degrees, PhD degrees or driver's licenses. So in some cases, we need governing bodies to decide things. cases in which we have a normative exclusion of markets, cases in which we have a positive exclusion of markets, cases in which markets should not do the job, and cases in which markets could not do the job. What are the exact tasks of governments then? Well, first of all, even if we allow markets to allocate scarce resources, we need a legal framework, right? For example, we need somebody to protect property rights. Because if property rights would not be protected, even if you have a market, well, the market would actually not work. Just to give you an example, if you go to this supermarket and you're eager to have your Snickers bar, and you just go to the cashier and say, well, this is the Snickers bar, and I'm going to pay $1.50 for the Snickers bar. And the person at the cashier just takes your money, but also takes the Snickers bar and says, thank you, bye-bye. Right? You have paid for it, but you haven't received the good. That wouldn't work, right? You need somebody to guarantee that if you pay, you get the good, right? On the other hand, or the other way around, if you go to that supermarket and say, well, give me a bar of chocolate, and the shop owner gives you a bar of chocolate, and you say, well, thank you for that, bye-bye, you're not paying, right? This is just the other way around. This could not work. If you get something, you have to pay for that, right? So you need somebody to, or a governing institution that protects your property rights, even if you want to use the market. This is what governments usually provide, a legal framework, not only for markets, of course, but also in other cases, in order to prevent crime, for example. Also in order to protect your country from aggressive forces outside of your country. All these things are part of this legal order that governments usually provide. The second thing that markets do, that governments do, is in the case of market failure, so the positive exclusion of markets, we need governments to intervene. We need governments to allocate resources that cannot be allocated by markets. Then there's another task, which is redistribution. We might end up with results of market allocation that we as a society do not accept. Some people becoming extremely rich and some people starving, to use an extreme. If a society says, well, this is not for justice reasons, even if the market, even if this is efficient, even if the market generates this kind of distribution of goods, we as a society, we think this is not fair, right? We should prevent people from starving. And we should also see that, people do not become overly rich, right? So redistribution, higher taxes for rich people, lower taxes for poor people, for example. Social security system. This is part of the redistributional task of governments. So just creating more social justice by fixing problems with market outcomes. This is another task of governments. And the last one is, even if markets work, and we have good examples in the recent past, we have fluctuations in economic performance. We have boom phases where the economy does very well and there are a lot of jobs and a lot of money around and everybody gets rich. But we also have phases, recession phases, where the economy suffers a lot, where people get unemployed, where a lot of people are poor, they don't have enough money for buying food or paying their rents for their apartments, right? So even if the market is functioning, providing efficient solutions, allocation of resources, we might get fluctuations of very good boom phases and very bad recession phases. And in order not to make this fluctuation too big, government intervention might be needed. Governments that maybe cushion some of the boom phases, and on the other hand, support the economy in phases of recessions. This is another task of governments, stabilization task, not letting boom phases be too extreme, not being recessions too extreme, just stabilizing economic development over time. So these are major functions of governments, and from now on we're going to focus on one of these functions, which is market failure. So we're going to talk about one specific market failure, which is external effects, in the next chapter of today's session.